Hi everybody, it's great to be here. Great to see so many familiar faces, especially in the front row. As Aditi was saying, I have been involved in covering this topic for my newspaper. So it's kind of, I can never seem to get away from it. So here we go again. But it's one of great importance, and I know of great interest to the Jewish community and beyond. So I'm glad that we have a chance to discuss it here. What I thought I'd do is take maybe half of our time to have a conversation on stage. I'll throw out a few questions. I'm sure there'll be plenty of interesting dialogue on that, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience and take it from there. So I thought a good place to start, if you get the latest copy of J in your mailbox, you'll know that this week was BDS made more headway locally. San Jose State University and UC Santa Cruz, the student governments there both passed divestment measures, adding to the tally of schools here in California and across the country to have passed similar resolutions. So the momentum for BDS continues. Everybody knows what BDS stands for, right? Anyone not know? So we can define our terms. BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions against Israel. It's generally a tactic. Some people call it a movement, others call it a tactic for trying to affect some change, moving the needle. Some people consider it anti-Semitic. Some people see it in other ways, and we'll probably get into a lot of that. So, having said that, I thought a good place to get the conversation going is, even with the momentum of the passage this week and beyond, I think the tally is up to about 40 universities in the country that have passed resolutions. Maybe Tammi knows the exact number better than I do. As far as I know, not a single university is actually divested any of their holdings from companies that do business with Israel, or as BDS proponents would say, profit from the occupation. So the question I want to pose to everyone is, how significant is this movement on campus when the results so far have been merely symbolic? What is the greater meaning here? Who wants to handle it?
I'll just start with a very brief opening that will not only touch on the campus, but the broader implications of the BDS movement. And indeed, there is a BDS movement. It was established in 2005. It had three demands. The third demand, which would result in the elimination of the state of Israel. So I want to make it clear, we're not talking about criticism of Israeli government policy, even strong criticism of Israeli government policy. Rather, we're talking about a movement that seeks the elimination of the state of Israel. And what I think is important to understand is that movement is not trying really to, today, diminish Israel's economic power or even have a major tangible effect. I mean, that would be optimal. But they don't really expect they're going to get universities to divest from Israel. What they're battling for is the hearts and minds of the next generation of young leaders in America. They're not going to change so much the attitudes of Congress today. But the folks that are going to be in Congress tomorrow, the folks who are going to be leaders in America, that's what they're going for. And the real use of the tactic of BDS is really about trying to use a kind of a hammer to reframe the understanding of what Israel represents in this world. That Israel should be seen as evil, that it should be seen in the same context as South African apartheid, that Zionism should be seen, and the very topic of today's discussion should be seen as something that is a bad actor in this world, and therefore there is a total attempt to rebrand Israel and Zionism and to win over the hearts and minds of young people, and not only on campuses, but wherever there's a soft underbelly, wherever there's a soft target, whether it's in the cultural institutions, the ethnic communities, the corporate boardrooms, City Hall, wherever they think they can make inroads. So I think that's a huge challenge that we face in this arena.
I I agree with what you say, Doug, completely, but I want to add another dimension to that, which is another dimension of the BDS movement. It's not only to demonize and delegitimize Israel, the Jewish state, but it's to demonize and delegitimize anyone who supports Israel, or anyone who's perceived to support Israel. It's called their anti-normalization campaign, and it's making sure that Zionists are not normal. As they said, I guess, Peter, at where you teach at CUNY last week, Zionists out of CUNY. It's an attempt to get the Zionist narrative and anyone who supports that to really not exist, or to delegitimize them and to demonize them to such an extent that they will not speak out. And what we deal with, it's not BDS, it's not even Israel, our organization on that issue, it's really the fallout of that, which is the impact of BDS, the anti-Semitic impact of what I too believe is an anti-Semitic movement on Jewish students on college campuses. And I think that that's the area where we, as a Jewish community, need to put a lot of energy and effort and attention, because that's a really important, and to this extent, not so much focused on casualty of this BDS war, is the impact, we're talking real anti-Semitic impact. We're talking about students who are assaulted. We're talking about Jewish property that's damaged and destroyed. We're talking about heckling and swastikas and discrimination against Jewish candidates for student government. We're talking about classic anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic actions that are a direct result of the BDS movement. And on every campus where we have seen a BDS campaign, we have seen anti-Semitic actions follow. Right? And every major, and many of you have probably heard of the high-profile anti-Semitic activity that's happened on UC campuses, the swastikas on the fraternity house, and on the cars at UC Davis, the Zionists to the gas chamber graffiti at UC Berkeley, at UCLA, and just recently, past week at UC Santa Cruz, we have candidates or student government, either candidates or individuals in student government being told that they shouldn't vote or shouldn't be eligible for office because they have a Jewish agenda, right? We're talking about blatant anti-Semitism, and those high-profile examples that we've seen, every one of them is connected to BDS in some way. And so I think that this is a real serious issue on college campuses across the country, because that's where we see the BDS. Yes, we see it at co-ops and other places in the community, but I think really ground zero are colleges and university campuses, and the impact is great. The impact, we just did a study a few weeks ago, an online study of 230 UC Jewish students, who 70% of whom reported that they had experienced or witnessed anti-Semitic action. Okay, whether that was heckling or swastikas or assaults, 70%. And virtually all of them said that they believed that BDS contributed to a hostile environment for Jewish students, and that's a serious problem.
Peter, I have a feeling you have a more nuanced
Well, I guess whether it's more nuances in the eye of the beholder. But I do see the context differently. I think it's important to understand that the BDS movement is first and foremost a Palestinian movement, and you have to understand the Palestinian context out of which it comes. That's not to say the impact on Jewish students on campus is not important, it's extremely important. But we have to understand the Palestinian context out of which it comes. It's no coincidence that the BDS movement began in 2005. It began in 2005 in the wake of a second intifada that had been disastrous for Palestinians, and it was conceived as a non-violent method of struggle against Israel among people who did not want to use violence. Now, I say this as an opponent of the BDS movement, but I just think that's one thing important to understand about the BDS movement. The second thing about the BDS movement is that it came out of Palestinian civil society. Palestinian civil society groups, because Palestinians were extremely dissatisfied with their political leadership. Palestinian political leadership on both the Hamas and the Fatah side is corrupt, and authoritarian, and Palestinians are very unhappy about the lack of political unity. So the BDS movement was an effort to create unity among Palestinians across and do an end run around Palestinian politicians. And it was also, and this is very important, it was an effort to unify Palestinians. The Palestinian people are deeply divided. They're divided between the West Bank and Gaza, and travel between the West Bank and Gaza is now very difficult, and those Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? We call them Arab Israelis, but they actually mostly call themselves now Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians in the diaspora. This is a very fragmented people, right? And so the BDS movement, as you mentioned, has 3 planks. It's important to say what those planks are, right? Because each of them are there for a reason. The first is a withdrawal by Israel to the 1967 lines. Right? That's one. That was specifically put in there to answer the concerns of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, who are under military occupation by Israel. The second was complete equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel inside the Green Line. And the third, I think this is the one you were referring to as meeting Israel's destruction, was the full right of return of refugees and their children back to Israel, because from a Palestinian perspective, it doesn't make a lot of sense that a Jew can come from Ukraine, whose family lived in Israel 2,000 years ago, but a Palestinian who grew up in Sfat or in Jaffa or in Haifa can't return, or their children can't return. I want to say this, I say this as a Zionist and as an opponent of the BDS movement, but it's important to understand where it comes from in terms of Palestinian politics if you want to understand how to respond to it effectively. It is true that the major leaders of the BDS movement do not accept the legitimacy of a Jewish state within any borders. That is true. They see, and many of them are citizens, many leaders of the BDS movement are citizens of Israel themselves. They are Arab Israelis, or Arab Israelis living in the diaspora, and they see Zionism as consigning them, and a Jewish state consigning them to permanent second-class citizenship. But if you want to, but they also, the BDS movement also gains many adherents who are not militantly opposed to Israel's existence within any borders, but who are fundamentally disturbed and upset by the fact that for almost 50 years now, Israel has controlled territory in the West Bank in which Palestinians live under military law, without a passport, without the right to vote for the government that controls their lives, and without free movement, even though their Jewish neighbors enjoy all of those things. And if you want to try to convince those people, not the hardcore, but the people around them, if you want to convince them to oppose BDS, you have to show them some other plausible mechanism by which those Palestinians in the West Bank can enjoy the basic rights that you and I take for granted. And if you can't answer that question, you're not going to defeat the BDS movement.
Thank you. So let me just take issue with a couple of things that were said. Actually, first, let me agree with Doug and say that I agree with everything that he said about characterizing BDS and the BDS movement. I'm going to disagree with you, Dan, and say that BDS doesn't stand for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. It stands for bias, division, and sanctimony. I think it's, and we can get into all of the reasons why that is. One other thing I just want to quibble with, which is that one of the goals of the BDS movement, it's not the withdrawal of Israel to 67 borders. It's the end, no, it's not the first plank. The first plank is the end of the occupation, which may mean for someone a withdrawal to the 67 borders, but it's purposefully ambiguous because there are many people who are proponents of BDS who do see this as a means to an end to the destruction of Israel and do view all of Israel from 1948 onward as an occupation. And therefore, they don't talk about an end to the conflict. They don't talk only about equality for Palestinians. They also talk about an end to the occupation because this is a nod to those who say we want to work towards the destruction of Israel, and this is a very clever way to get at that. Back to the original premise of the question, I think it's true. It's not significant. There aren't any meaningful, measurable ways in which BDS has been successful in achieving any of its goals. We're really talking in the realm of the discourse, the public discourse. But in the fact that we are having this session today, and the fact that there are those discussions on campus, and Doug alluded to this before, we're already losing. We've already lost. Because the conversation is about the legitimacy of Israel and whether or not it should be legitimate. It's legitimizing delegitimization. It's making it into something which is an accepted position to hold, rather than something which is very, very extreme, even beyond the pale of the negotiations that have gone on between the State of Israel and the Palestinian Authority and other parties. So I think the fact that we're actually having the conversation is a very serious and very troubling facet.
Before we get off the college campus arm of the BDS movement, I wanted to bring up a topic that I'm sure you all have some thoughts about, and that is something I learned talking to members of Jewish Voice for Peace, and that is a concept called intersectionality. You might have seen banners and posters, especially since last summer, that read, "From Ferguson to Gaza." And this was an attempt to link the struggles of African Americans here against oppressive police forces to the Palestinian struggle. And beyond the headlines and banners, there's been a very successful effort to corral new allies from the BDS movement from among other ethnic minorities, most significantly African Americans, but also in Hispanic world and beyond, Asian Americans. They're finding intersectionality between their movements and the Palestinian movement. I wonder if you guys could weigh in on the significance of that.
This is one of the very disturbing trends, I would say, of the movement. And it's also an indication of why there's no real shortcut in terms of addressing the challenge. That ultimately, one of the reasons why we're losing ground with the African American community and the Latino community is not just that the Palestinian narrative is being framed in a way that is creating a sense of sympathy and connection for many and other minority communities, but because the Jewish community has increasingly become absent from the table. Absent from the table of coalition building, absent from the table of reaching out to other communities. And if we're going to be successful long-term in addressing these challenges, we have to restore our ability to engage with other communities. It means just as Israel's survival may be one of our primary passions as a Jewish community, we also have to be aware and committed to what their primary concerns are, whether it's racial justice in America, immigration reform, or other issues as well. And there's a great asymmetry that has emerged in this area. So I mention this because a lot of people after last summer, after last year's kind of constant flow of anti-Israel, pro-BDS actions on college campuses around the country, and particularly in California, everybody was looking for the magic bullet. And the answer is there is no shortcut. We have to be sure that we don't create a vacuum at intergroup tables. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see 17 groups aligned on one side against the pro-Israel Jewish students on the other, and maybe a few additional voices. We have to disrupt that pattern that's emerging. It's a very serious concern because it's happening with ever greater pace.
I think if one wants to understand why the BDS movement is gaining more allies, it's worth listening to the explanation that the BDS movement's leaders give itself. I think that the most prominent global BDS leader is a guy named Omar Barghouti, and this is what Omar Barghouti said at Columbia University last December, quote, We've got to give credit to Netanyahu. Without him, we could not have reached this far at this time. It could have taken much longer, but with the help of the Israeli government, our biggest closet supporters in the world, we're going much faster. What is he talking about? As my fellow panelists mentioned, the basic thrust of the BDS movement is to make no real distinction between Israel on the two sides of the Green Line. Between the side of Israel where Palestinian citizens have the right to vote and live under the same law and serve in the Knesset on the Supreme Court, and the West Bank where Palestinians live under military law under a completely different legal system than their Jewish neighbors, without the citizenship in any state that their Jewish neighbors enjoy. As the Israeli government has, through its massive subsidizing of settlements, progressively erased the significance of the Green Line, creating a one-state reality, it has done the BDS movement's work for it. By erasing the distinction between these democratic and non-democratic Israel, it has made it much easier for the BDS movement to say, you know what, it's all one apartheid state. There's one other thing I think is worth understanding about some of these BDS movement allies that are growing. and this may be difficult for American Jews to hear, but it's true. They know things we don't. The reason they know things we don't is that they go spend time with Palestinians on the West Bank. When these liberal churches or the trade unions, what they do is they take delegations to spend time with Palestinians in the West Bank. You know who doesn't do that? Us. American synagogue trips, Jewish schools, JCCs, when they go to Israel, AIPAC trips, by and large, they spend almost no time interacting with Palestinians in the West Bank. And you know what happens when people go and spend time and spend a day or two living with people who've lived their entire lives, and their parents have lived almost their entire lives, under military law, without citizenship, without free movement? They get very, very disturbed by it. And you know what? You would too if you haven't had that experience. You can ask very, very proudly Zionistic people. When they go see that, it's very disturbing to them. They come back very upset. And the American Jewish community often doesn't really quite understand what they're so upset about it, because we don't go see it ourselves. And that's the moral force, the anger that is leading people towards supporting the BDS movement. And as I said, if we want to oppose it, as I do, we have to give people other ways of expressing that fundamental opposition to what is a denial of basic human rights.
So once again, I'm going to disagree a little bit here. I can tell you that ADL does lead some of those missions that you alluded to. We do it for our own leadership. We do it for leaders of various communities, including student leaderships. And we make sure that those students and those leaders and our own leaders have the opportunity to engage in substantial and substantive ways with Palestinian leadership and Palestinians, both in the West Bank and in Israel proper. So I don't think that that's necessarily what's going on. I think what you do see is, again, I'll agree with Doug, which is you have quite a bit of relationship building that's gone on, and where the Jewish community has fallen short on that. And we tend to harken back to, we did great things in the civil rights movement, and we did great things once upon a time, and look at all the things that we've done for whatever community it is, and how can they be lining up with BDS? It just doesn't make any sense. The notion is that these relationships they are not transactional. They need to be transformative. So we expect people to stand with us, we need to stand with them. And we need to do so consistently and throughout time and over time. And so it's very important for us to be able to, and this is difficult because right now our community is feeling very much besieged, and we are focused on defending ourselves. And how can we try to do all these other things and engage in these meaningful relationships with others when we really need to concentrate on our own issues? The answer is that we have to. We have to be engaged in the campus, in the community as a whole, if we really want to see allies come forward and stand with us and step up on our behalf. So again, I think those relationships are really critical. And when we see that happen, when we see, and we know this from Israel advocacy, we know this from lots of other things that we do. When you have a friend that you know who says, this bothers me, you're going to say, okay, I'm probably going to be bothered too. When you have a friend who says that I've been attacked, you say, oh, well, how can I help you? And that's what BDS proponents have done. They've gone out, they've engaged in this relationship building, and then they have said, this is something where my community is under threat, this is very important to me, I want you to come and stand with me, and then whatever it is that's said, it doesn't matter whether or not it's true. Apartheid and genocide and all the other road terms that are thrown around, it's a friend that is coming to them and saying, I need you to stand with me against this thing, this horrible thing, and they say, okay, I will. And we need to do a better job of standing with those other groups, with building coalitions, with involving others, and then they will do the same for us. They will stand up for us.
Just want to bring it back again to Jewish students on the campus, which is really my focus and my vantage point. And there really is an extreme disparity and double standard, a discriminatory double standard that's really applied when it comes to Jewish students. And that, and I think we're going to see it a lot now as these protests and unrest happen on campus. Really, they're catching on like wildfire on campuses across the country, where there has been a real focus. If any of the incidents that we've seen that have happened to Jewish students were to happen to another ethnic or racial, gender, ethnic minority, they would be dealt with in a nanosecond by the administration. When they happen to Jewish students, they're either not dealt with at all, or they're dealt with in a really inadequate way. And I think that this is something that we as a Jewish community really need to understand, that Jewish students are not treated in the same way as other racial, ethnic, gender minorities. There is a real discriminatory double standard, one that I believe even borders on anti-Semitism, that Jewish students are not being treated in the same way, and their concerns and their issues about bigotry and about harassment and discrimination are just not being treated in the same way as other minorities. And I think it's a serious problem. And then when it comes to if you look at, let's say, the issue UC San Diego in a few years ago, there was a racist themed fraternity party called the Compton Cookout. And then a little bit later, there was a noose that was found in the library. And within hours, there was a firestorm of reaction and response from everybody on every campus at the highest level. In fact, the federal government came marching in, the Department of Justice, the Department of Education, to deal with these racist incidents. But similar and really analogous things have been happening to Jewish students semester after semester, year after year, and nobody cares. In fact, what they say is free speech, it's academic freedom, so the same things. So I think that this is a real serious issue. I understand that there is a concern, that there is a narrative that's being expressed on the campus. But the fact is that narrative is having a horribly discriminatory and harmful effect on Jewish students. And if we as a community don't deal with that, then we're not going to be able to deal with really the problem. I think the problem of BDS altogether.
I just want to make two comments. First, in terms of what Tammi just said. I want us to be a little bit cautious in terms of painting with too broad a brush. The fact is there are administrators who have lagged behind in terms of showing leadership, and there are administrators on Bay Area campuses who have shown tremendous leadership. The biggest challenge is that sometimes they have been slow to appreciate how strong the tensions are on campus and how intentional the effort is by the BDS movement to create an intimidating atmosphere for Jewish students on campus. So it's an educational process that we need to engage in, and more administrators are appreciating that this is something of a different order than other debates that have emerged on campus. It's like all the other parts of relationship building. This is a neutral force, not enemy camp, that we have to build a relationship with and help understand why this has to be taken seriously. What we often say to administrators is protect free speech on campus and don't develop a case of laryngitis yourself. And many administrators have shown their willingness to increasingly speak up. The other thing I want to say just very quickly in response to what Peter was talking about, one area where I think he and I would find some common ground, the only way to beat the BDS movement in the end is to do it with a broad tent approach. We have to make sure that we don't narrow who's defined as being in the pro-Israel tent if we want to be successful. Most of the issues that are emerging from the very far left. And oftentimes the most credible voices in addressing those challenges will come from progressive voices who do want to talk with a language of empathy about both Israelis and Palestinians, and who do want to talk about a two-state solution, and who do need to identify alternatives in terms of identifying, for example, projects where Jews and Palestinians are trying to build a better future together, so that the effort and the approach is don't divest from Israel, invest in peace. And it's critically important that we take that approach if we're really going to move hearts and minds on this.
There are so many aspects to the BDS movement in terms of academic boycotts, which we've heard about, inroads into the corporate boardroom, churches, mainline Protestant churches. We don't have time to go into all of those in this kind of detail, but I wanted to bring up one thing that's been in the news lately, that even though it goes beyond the borders of our country, I'd love to get your comments, and that is the EU just now instituting labeling of products made in the West Bank, Israeli products made in the West Bank. I just read that a major chain of department stores in Germany has been the first to step up and discontinue selling those products.
They retracted it.
They
Retract it? Oh, news never
Use
said.
is faster.
Okay, well, the labeling is still
In
on.
wider.
And so maybe you could address that, and then more importantly, I'm curious to know your thoughts about, just as a tactic, the effectiveness of this kind of thing. Could it have any kind of impact, positive or negative, or is it merely just punitive? You think the labeling would be instituted to bring about some kind of desired effect. Hard to know what that is, but maybe you guys have some thoughts.
I support the labeling of supplement goods. I think it's, the reason I do it is because I think it's if you believe that what is precious about Israel is Israeli democracy, it is very important to distinguish between the Israel created in 1948, which is a democracy, and the Israel created in 1967, which is not a democracy. If the vast majority of people in the territory you can control do not have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives and live under military law, you're not a democracy. Israel and the West Bank is not a democracy. Therefore, allowing people to see the difference between products made in non-democratic Israel and democratic Israel allows them to make that moral separation that I believe is crucial to Israel's survival. Because it is we can say we don't like the term apartheid. I don't like the term apartheid either. But it's been used now by Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak, both of whom have forecasted this is the future for Israel. This is their word. If Israel becomes a country that permanently controls millions of people who lack basic rights, this is not an irrelevant or incidental fact in the rise of the BDS movement. And by labeling settlement goods, you give people a chance to say, you know what, I support a democratic Jewish state, but I don't support a non-democratic Jewish state. And that distinction, I think, is absolutely crucial to Israel's long-term survival, because I truly believe as a Zionist, that a non-democratic Israel is a dead Israel.
So I think we have to be careful about how these things play out, and when they play out in the real world, and what are the implications and what are the repercussions. So one of the things that we've seen happen is when we start down this path of labeling goods from the West Bank, what we end up seeing is stores will remove all kosher products. And we've seen it in Britain, we've seen it elsewhere in Europe, and we've seen it elsewhere around the world. So instead, it's what starts off as something which may be, in the abstract, stands for democracy, an effort to, in a peaceful way, push towards a diplomatic solution. The implications are, and may not necessarily be anti-Semitic, the implications are, and the outcomes are, very much about anti-Semitism. And I think you see the same thing on campuses too, right? You see BDS is not necessarily inherently an anti-Semitic thing, but what it ends up invariably leading to are episodes of anti-Semitism. And it's very, very troubling to see that. So we have to be careful about and understand what are going to be the implications of these policies and what's going to be the outcomes, and what will that lead to. And in this case, it leads to a normalization of discrimination against Jews, not about a statement on the occupation or Israel or the peace process or the democracy in Israel. And that's very troubling. I just want to go back to something else that was said before, which is I really think it is not constructive and it's not helpful for us to engage in comparative victimization. There are very real and serious issues on college campuses today of racism, and we heard about the episode at UC San Diego. You've been watching the news, you see things at Missouri, at Yale, and other campuses across the country where there are very serious instances of racism that are playing out. And we need to stand, again, not because this is a good strategy or a good tactic, because it's the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do. It's the Jewish thing to do. It's the Zionist thing to do, to stand against racism. And to stand against it when we see it visited against us or against any other party. And so we should not dismiss the fact that because people have stood up and forcefully spoken out against racism, they should. We should also see them speak out against anti-Semitism, and sometimes that requires a bit of an educational process helping to understand why certain expressions which may be ostensibly try to link to the Arab-Israeli conflict, it's not about that actually. These are code words, and these are actually expressions of anti-Semitism. And we need to do a good job of educating those folks and giving them the tools to understand why that might be anti-Semitism and why they need to speak up.
Doug has a 30-second comment, and then we'll take
we have exactly 5 minutes left.
I'll do this very quickly. Two things on the EU settlement issue, which I think is very problematic on multiple fronts. But one is, I just want everybody here to understand, it's not just the West Bank, it's East Jerusalem, it's the Golan Heights as well. The second thing I want to say about it is that, like a number of these others, the BDS movement often tries to push things forward, like divestment issues on campus, and say it's not associated with the BDS movement itself. We're not seeking the elimination of the state of Israel. But it's always the BDS movement that's been behind these efforts, and that's a source of concern here. Find me a store in Europe that marks as disputed territory Russian goods because of the Crimea, and disputed territory Azerbaijani and Armenian goods because of Nagorno-Karabakh, and disputed territory for Turkish and Greek goods because of Cyprus, and on top of everything else for the few other hundreds of disputed territories, and therefore they're going to be consistent across the board, I would have less of an issue with it. The problem that we have that I think underlies all of this is the tendency to put Israel under this unbelievable microscope that no other country in the world is placed in.
Yeah, sometimes Israel does suffer from double standard, but I mean, the European Union has sanctions against Russia for what it's doing in Ukraine. Not just against Ukraine itself, but against the entire of Russia. So it seems to me to suggest that somehow Israel is getting a harder shake because we're labeling settlement goods when the EU is boycotting all of Russia. Financial sanctions against all of Russia suggests that sometimes we're a little too quick to suggest that Israel always gets the worst part of the deal.
We don't have too much time, but got to get some feedback from you guys. I saw your hand first in the back.
No questions, really? No questions?
Yeah. I saw you in the way back first.
This is a question for Peter. Peter, I'm a college student at Stanford, and I share many of your views and understandings and assumptions, and I've fought BDS on my own campus for many years now. It's been very difficult, especially recently. And I want to ask you, who so cogently explains to our community how to see the perspective of the other side and to understand where they're coming from and how to respond to their arguments. At the end of the day, what makes you still stand up there and say, I'm a liberal Zionist and I oppose BDS and I still stand for Israel? Because and I ask this as someone who shares many of your views and perspectives. We don't often get to hear that from you, so I'd love to hear that from you.
I'm a liberal Zionist and I support a certain kind of Jewish state for two reasons. First of all, because in a post-Holocaust world, I want there to be one state on the earth that has Jewish self-protection as its mission statement. I was in high school when Jews sent airplanes to pick up the Jews of Ethiopia, among the poorest and most destitute people on earth, and those people would probably be dead if the state of Israel had not brought them to be reunited with the people from whom they've been estranged since the days when the temple stood. I'm not willing to give up the idea that we need one state in the world dedicated to Jewish self-protection. The second reason that I believe in a democratic Jewish state alongside a democratic Palestinian state is because I think binationalism doesn't work. It barely works in Belgium. The reality is they're two intensely nationalistic communities. There is no supranational identity beyond being Jewish and Palestinian. Both people want a state of their own which represents them. That's why I think what many in the BDS movement want is a secular binational state, an Israelstein. The problem with Israelstein is there's no Israelstein identity. The Israelstein army will not hold together under conditions of extreme stress because people will not be loyal to Israelstein, they will be loyal to being Jewish and Palestinian. That's why people moved to the idea of partition in the 1930s in the first place, because one state was heading towards civil war. That's what I tell people to my left, and I think it's worth noting there are a not insignificant number of Jewish students who are non or anti-Zionists who support the BDS movement, and one has to make that argument to them again and again and again. And saying that they're simply anti-Semitic or self-hating is not a very effective tactic.
I know that everybody has many questions. unfortunately, we have a very special session at 5 o'clock in the gym. What I'd like to do is to have each of the panelists just spend 30 seconds wrapping up. If you didn't have a chance to talk, if you have any other points to make on that.
We could do that, or we could take one more question. One more question. Yes. The young lady standing up. In black.
Two. I actually really feel like I need to clarify something. I'm sorry. I'm going to talk for all candidate of social welfare at UC Berkeley. So first of all, as a member of the UC campus, I just want to say that you're vastly exacerbating what it feels like for Jews on campus. That has never been my experience. I've been at school for 5 years. Second of all, you spoke to the issue of intersectionality, and it's just not what I understand intersectionality. Intersectionality has to do with layers of your own individual experience. So that would be if you're a queer woman of color, for instance. If you read critical race theory, if you read Frary, if you read Hooks, if you read Lord, this is what you understand intersectionality means. Saying Ferguson to Gaza, that's an experience of being an ally. And to not make that distinction, to not understand why communities of color want to ally with the Palestinian cause, I think represents a giant disconnect within this room, right? If we can't understand why those communities want to connect to the Palestinian community, and we are then talking about comparative victimization, I think that as a Jews we're not going to move forward if we're not understanding the experiences of other people of color, especially. Not a question. I just want to
We really cannot take any more questions. No, we really can't take any more questions. I'm sorry. The CEO is here, and we've got to finish this
Somebody from
particular
Cal
session.
wants to counter.
Okay, we can take it offline, please.
Excuse me, as a student,
We're going to end the formal session. Whoever needs to go, we're going to go now to the gym. Whoever wants to stay and ask questions can do so. Thank you very much for the
as a president of Schneider's Boys on Campus, and president of FIFA, I just want to say that something is grossly misrepresented. We do not want you guys to shut down free speech. We don't want to be protected, and we don't want to be victimized anymore. Jewish students should hear if there's anti-Semitism on campus. If we want Zionism, then we should hear that. If that is the reality, we should hear it, and it should strengthen our Jewish identity. And also, we should be standing with those people, not by having Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager speak out against Mike Brown rallies when we ourselves as students are fighting with them. That just makes it harder for us on campus. This right-wing agenda of shutting down free speech and making us sound like we're right-wing on every issue and that we just want to shut everything out, that isn't helping us as proud Zionists on campus. Believe me, I'm more Zionist than you could possibly imagine. We don't need to shut up free speech. We want to hear it. We want to be a part of